You remember the music of the galaxy. It was a symphony played across 1 trillion channels. The booming trade cant of the Grom Armada. The whispered poetry of the Cygnus singers. The joyful, chaotic chatter of 100 billion souls. You sat at your listening post, a lonely rock on the edge of nothing. Your job was to listen to it all, to feel the pulse of a living universe. Then the silence began. It started at the fringes, in the Scutum Centaurus arm. A single network went dark. You thought it was a solar flare, a maintenance cycle, a simple technical glitch. But then the next network winked out, and another. A creeping void was spreading across the star charts. A wave of absolute quiet was rolling through the cosmos. The music was fading, one instrument at a time. You called your superiors. They saw the same thing. Everyone saw it. Panic was a quiet, cold thing at first. Experts offered theories. A new kind of jamming technology, a cascading data failure, a sunspot cycle of unbelievable scale. No one wanted to say the truth. No one wanted to admit what you were all watching. You were watching the stars go out. The end of everything. The great symphony was over. The laughter and the songs were gone, replaced by a dead hiss, a static deeper and more profound than the space between worlds. You were the keeper of a silent library, the curator of dead signals. The galaxy had fallen quiet around you, leaving you and your small world utterly and terrifyingly alone. One night, or what passed for night on your station, it happened. A single note cut through the universal static. It was faint. It was broken. It was the most beautiful thing you had ever heard. A signal. It tore across the comm system like a ghost. A final, desperate echo from an unknown corner of the sky. It was raw, unfiltered, and filled with a pain that needed no translation. You and the team worked for days. You amplified the signal. You filtered out the noise. You pieced together the fragments. It was not a language you recognized, but the meaning was universal. It was a plea, a warning, a cry for help sent into the void with the last ounce of a civilization's strength. It was a map and a prayer combined, a single point of light in an endless night. The message showed images, glimpses of a people you did not know. It showed a shadow falling across their sun. It showed worlds turning to dust. It showed a hunger that ate the very light from their sky. The message repeated on a loop, a beacon of sorrow. Then, after 72 hours of this haunting plea, it too went silent. The galaxy was once again quiet, but the silence was different now. Before, it was empty, an absence of life. Now, it was a presence, a listening, waiting dark. That final message had changed everything. It proved you were not alone in the end, and it gave you one last, impossible choice: to hide in your quiet corner of space, or to answer the call. Humanity made its choice. The last message had galvanized every nation on Earth and its colonies. The debates were short. The arguments were few. For the first time in history, your entire species agreed on one thing. We will not let the night win. We will build a ship. We will answer the call. The Starship Vanguard was born from that promise. It was the greatest undertaking in human history. Mines on Mars worked around the clock. Factories on Luna churned out plasteel and wiring. Earth's orbital shipyards became a single, planet-spanning construction site. Everyone had a part to play. Everyone gave something. The ship was not built by a government. It was built by a species. It was our single, unified shout back into the darkness. You were chosen for the crew, not for your skill at the listening post. but for what you represented. You were the one who heard the call. You were the first witness to the silence, and the first to hear the echo. The Vanguard was an ark, a vessel of hope, but it was also a tomb for its crew, a one-way trip into the unknown. They say the naming committee almost called it the ship of insane optimism. Vanguard sounded better on the recruiting posters. You stood on the observation deck before the launch. You saw the ship in all its glory. It was not elegant. It was a brute. A fortress with engines powerful enough to tear a hole in space. It was humanity's iron will made manifest. A promise kept to a people already dead. The Vanguard was ready to sail the empty cosmic sea, and you were ready to sail with it. The goodbyes were quiet. You left behind a son you would never see again. You left a home you could never return to. The engines of the Vanguard ignited, a silent, brilliant star in the black. The journey was measured not in years, but in lifetimes. 100 years of travel, 100 years of suspended animation, a long sleep in the cold dark between galaxies. You walked to the cryo bay with the rest of the crew. Each of you found your assigned pod. There was no ceremony, just quiet nods and shared looks, a silent promise to see each other on the other side. The ship's AI, a calm, gentle voice named Solace, spoke to you. It assured you that it would watch over you, that it would keep the ship safe. The pod door hissed shut. A cold mist filled the small space. Your thoughts began to slow. Your last waking vision was of the star chart on the pod's display. A glowing line pointed the way, a path into an ocean of unending night. Your dreams were your only company now. You dreamed of the music, the symphony of the galaxy you once knew, and you prayed you would hear it again. Solace's voice was the first thing you heard, a gentle chime, a soft call to wakefulness. Captain, we have arrived. The mist in your pod receded. The door opened with a soft hiss. The cold of cryo-sleep clung to your bones. You felt ancient. You felt like a ghost. You and the senior crew gathered on the bridge. Your legs were unsteady. Your mind was still catching up. A century had passed. You stepped onto the bridge. The view screen was active. It showed the starscape ahead. But it was wrong. Horribly wrong. The sky was darker than you remembered. Emptier. Great swaths of the cosmos were simply gone. Patches of absolute black where vibrant nebulae and star clusters used to be. Your star charts were useless now. They were maps of a galaxy that no longer existed. The ship felt cold. The silence outside was heavier than before. It pressed against the hull. Solace reported no damage to the ship. All systems were green. The journey had been without incident. But you could feel it. The universe you awoke to was colder, harsher, more dangerous than the one you had left. This was not just the absence of light. This was an active, hungry darkness. You tried to raise Earth on the long-range comms. You knew it was a foolish hope, a shot in the dark across an impossible distance. The reply was exactly what you expected. Nothing. Just the same dead static, the same profound silence that had started this journey. You were truly cut off now. A single ship, a lonely crew, an island of light in a dying universe. You ordered the comms officer to open all channels. You wanted to listen, to see if anything was out there. The familiar hiss of empty space filled the bridge. But then, something else, something new. Underneath the static, there were whispers, faint, layered, and unnerving. They were not signals, not language. They were phantoms on the comms channel. At first, you thought it was an equipment malfunction, a side effect of the long journey. But the whispers grew clearer. They sounded like voices caught in a storm, distorted, overlapping. Sometimes they sounded like crying. Sometimes they sounded like a low, guttural growl. They were the sound of nightmares, the sound of something ancient and hungry. These were not the ghosts of dead civilizations. This was something else, something that wore their voices like a mask. The whispers would rise and fall. They seemed to react to your ship's presence. They coiled around your scans. They tasted your energy signatures. It was like you had woken up a predator that had been sleeping in the dark. A predator that was now aware of you. The crew grew tense. Sleep became difficult. The whispers seemed to seep through the ship's hull. You would hear them in the quiet corridors, in the hum of the life support. You were no longer just traveling through an empty void. You were traveling through someone's hunting ground. And the final, desperate echo you were chasing was leading you right into the heart of it. After weeks of this tense journey, you arrived. Solace announced your entry into the target system, the source of the desperate call. The view screen showed a single, dying star. A weak, red dwarf casting a pale, mournful light on its remaining planets. The system was a graveyard. Shattered moons and asteroid fields choked the orbits. This was a place of immense sorrow. Only one planet remained intact. Scans showed a weak energy grid, faint signs of life. You brought the Vanguard into a high, cautious orbit. You sent a simple message of peace, a greeting in 1,000 languages, both human and Xeno. The reply was almost instant. A weak signal, but a clear one. A set of coordinates for a landing zone, and a single repeated phrase in their language. A phrase that translated to, "Thank you for coming." You led the first contact team yourself. The shuttle ride down was quiet. The planet's atmosphere was thin, but breathable. The landscape was gray and tired. You landed in a vast, crumbling city. The architecture was elegant, even in its decay. Towers like carved bone reached for a sky with too few stars. And then you saw them, the survivors. They emerged from the shadows to greet you. They were tall and impossibly thin. Their movements were slow and graceful. They were echoes of a great civilization. Their eyes held a deep, ancient sadness. There were not many of them, a few hundred at most. They were not warriors. They were scholars, artists, and caretakers of a dying world. They had spent their final years sending one last story into the void. And you had heard it. The leader of the survivors called herself Lyra, the speaker. She led you deep into their city, into a great library filled with silent data crystals. They did not speak of battles or resistance. They spoke of the enemy as a force of nature, a change in the universe itself. They told you of the entity that hunts the stars, a presence that consumes light and life and thought. They gave it a name. In their language, it was a complex concept, a word that meant the absence of light and the end of memory. They offered you a simpler translation, one that you would understand. They called it the Shade. It was not a fleet of ships. It was not an empire. It was a wave of pure entropy, a living void that moved from star to star, and it fed on existence itself. Lyra showed you their history, not in books, but in projections of light and sound. You saw their star-born empire, a network of worlds glowing with life. Then you saw the Shade arrive. It was not an explosion. It was a smothering, a hole in reality that simply expanded. Stars would dim, planets would grow cold, and minds would just stop. Thought itself was a meal for this thing. They had tried to fight it. Their weapons were useless. Their shields were meaningless. How do you shoot at nothing? How do you block the end of all things? Their empire fell in decades. This world, Their first world was the last to remain. They had used their remaining energy to power the distress call, a final act of defiance, a warning sent to anyone who might still be listening. They knew they were doomed. Their star was weakening. The shade was closing in, but they had saved one last thing for you, a final secret. Their last great hope was not a weapon to defeat the darkness. It was a tool to create light. Lyra led you to the heart of their temple. There, floating in a containment field, was a shard of impossible beauty. It was a crystal, but it was more than that. It twisted in on itself. Its facets reflected stars that were not there. It was a piece of forgotten technology. A relic from a time before their people had forgotten how to dream big. Lyra explained that it was a shard of lumen, a device that could manipulate the fabric of light itself. It could focus it, amplify it, even create it from nothing. It was not a weapon in the traditional sense. You could not fire it like a cannon. It was a source, a seed of creation. They had built it long ago to terraform barren worlds, to bring light to dark places. They believed it was the only thing the shade might fear, not because it could destroy it, but because it represented everything the shade was not. It was a symbol of existence itself. They offered it to you freely. Their time was over. Their story was written, but yours was not. They saw the strength in humanity, the stubborn, irrational hope, the willingness to sail into the night to answer a stranger's call. They were giving you their last ember. They were asking you to carry the flame. The shard pulsed with a soft, gentle light, a promise of a dawn they would never see. The decision was made without a formal vote. It was a shared understanding. Your people and hers would face the end together. You were no longer just the crew of the vanguard. You were the last alliance. Your two peoples joined forces against the coming darkness. They had the knowledge. You had the technology. And together, you had a plan. A desperate, beautiful, and probably foolish plan. The days that followed were a blur of activity. Their scholars and your engineers worked side by side. Language barriers faded away. They learned from your practical, rugged designs. You learned from their elegant, star-born science. It was a perfect fusion of two different philosophies. A joke made the rounds about their energy drink tasting like sweetened static. But it kept everyone awake, and everyone needed to be awake. The plan was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. The shade consumed light and energy, so you would give it a feast. You would turn the vanguard into a beacon, a lighthouse. You would use the shard of lumen to create a wave of energy so immense, so powerful, it would not just feed the darkness. It would choke it. A flash of creation to push back the void. It was a one-way trip, a final stand in every sense of the word. The energy required would tear the ship apart. The survivors knew this. Your crew knew this. No one flinched. No one hesitated. Humanity had crossed a galaxy to be here. You would not fail now. You would make the darkness remember what it felt like to face the light. The vanguard was brought down from orbit. It landed in the skeletal remains of their greatest shipyard. Then, the real work began. The ship was torn apart. Its systems were refitted. Its purpose was reforged. The vanguard was no longer an ark for exploration. It was becoming a weapon of impossible power. Human engineers grumbled that the alien blueprints lacked a certain respect for safety railings. Their engineers guided your teams. They showed you how to integrate the shard of lumen into the vanguard's warp core. The two technologies were never meant to meet. One was for travel. The other was for creation. Forcing them together was like trying to teach a hammer how to sing. But slowly, it worked. The ship's conduits began to glow with a new, ethereal light. You watched the transformation with awe. The main deflector dish was recalibrated. It was no longer a shield. It was now a lens, a massive focusing array for the power you were about to unleash. The entire ship, from its engines to its viewports, was being redesigned for a single, glorious purpose: to burn as brightly as a newborn star. Just for a moment, the survivors treated the Vanguard with a quiet reverence. They would place their hands on its hull. They would whisper thanks to the cold metal. You were their vengeance. You were their legacy. As the final systems were locked into place, a deep hum filled the air, a hum of immense contained power. The Vanguard was ready. It was no longer just a human ship. It was the last hope of two worlds. You did not have to wait long. A klaxon blared through the shipyard, a single, mournful tone. A lookout satellite on the edge of the system had gone dark. Lyra stood beside you on the Vanguard's new bridge. She did not need to say a word. You could feel it, a coldness spreading through the system. The last light was beginning to fade. The shade had arrived. The Vanguard rose from the planet one last time. Its ascent was slow, majestic. It took its position between the dying star and the last world, a lone sentinel against the night. On the view screen, you saw it. It was not a ship. It was not a creature. It was a perfect absence, a hole in the fabric of space. The stars behind it did not just disappear. They were erased. The presence washed over your sensors, your comms filled with those same hungry whispers. Louder now, clearer, they spoke of endings, of peace in the silent dark. They were tempting, seductive, the lies of an ancient predator. You ordered the comms officer to broadcast on all channels. Not words, but music, an old piece from Earth, a symphony of defiance. The shade moved without speed. It simply expanded. The edge of the void crept closer. The pale red light of the star began to dim. The cold of deep space seeped into the bridge. The ship's hull groaned under a pressure that was not physical. This was a battle for existence itself. And your ship stood alone against the all-consuming entity. The order you gave was the simplest of your career. Light it up. The engineers slammed their hand down on the activation panel. Deep within the ship, the shard of lumen flared to life. It pulsed once, a heartbeat of pure creation. The warp core screamed in protest as it was flooded with energy it was never meant to contain. The entire ship vibrated. Power conduits glowed white-hot. On the view screen, the deflector dish began to shine. A small point of light appeared at its center. It grew brighter, and brighter still. It became a miniature sun, a star born from human will and alien hope. You felt the power building, a wave of pure energy straining against the ship's containment fields. The Vanguard was about to become the last lighthouse. You had to time it perfectly. Too soon, and the blast would dissipate. Too late, and you would be consumed. The whispers grew to a roar. The darkness was just moments from your ship. The pressure was immense. You felt your own thoughts begin to fray at the edges. The temptation to just stop, to let the quiet in. You pushed it back. You remembered the music of a living galaxy. And you gave the final command. Now. A wave of pure, white energy erupted from the Vanguard. It was not a beam. It was an explosion of reality itself. A shockwave of light and creation that slammed into the approaching void. There was no sound, only a blinding, overwhelming brilliance. The whispers on the comms channel turned into a single, unified scream of agony, a shriek of a thing that had never known pain. The shade recoiled. The perfect edge of its darkness warped and buckled. The light from your ship did not destroy it. It pushed it back. It filled the void with existence, forcing the nothing to retreat. The Vanguard groaned, its systems failing. The light flickered, but it held. Against all odds, you held the line. You were a beacon of impossible power against an endless void. The light from your beacon faded. The ship was a wreck. Systems were failing everywhere. But you were alive. The Vanguard was still in one piece, and the shade was gone. It had retreated back into the dark spaces between galaxies. Wounded, repelled, but not destroyed. You had won the battle, not the war. But as you looked at your sensor displays, you saw something impossible. The energy wave from your ship had done more than push back the darkness. It had echoed. It had traveled across the silent cosmos. A pulse of life sent into the emptiness. And something was answering back. On the long-range sensors, a single light flickered. A dormant comms buoy reawakened by your pulse. Then another, and another. Faint signals, old call signs. Ghosts were waking up. They were not signs of thriving civilizations. They were automated systems, distress beacons, forgotten archives flicking back on. The digital ghosts of a galaxy you thought was dead. Your beacon had not just been a weapon. It had been a spark. A cosmic defibrillator that shocked the dead network back to a faint, fragile life. The silence was broken, not by music, but by echoes. And echoes were enough. You stood on the shattered bridge of the Vanguard. Your home was a galaxy away. Your original mission was over. But a new one was just beginning. You looked at Lyra, at your crew, at the flickering lights on the star map. The galaxy was not dead. It was sleeping. It was hiding. It needed someone to relight the way. It needed a guardian. Humanity had stumbled into a war for existence itself. You had answered a call from a dying world. And in doing so, you had found your new purpose. You would not be conquerors. You would not be explorers. You would be keepers of the flame. The Vanguard, or whatever ships came after, would patrol the quiet sectors. You would be a shield for the worlds that were reawakening. You would be the lighthouses for all. The new dawn was quiet, uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, it was not dark.